The NSDA Public Forum Resolution for Nationals is resolved. The United States federal government should enforce antitrust regulations on technology giants. In this lecture, I'll walk you through the key terms of the resolution so that you can gain an understanding of it and discuss some critical background information. In the next lectures, I'll look at the pro and con arguments in more detail. So there'll be 3 lectures actually, this introductory lecture, a pro lecture, and a con lecture. So now let's move on and look at some of the key terms of the resolution. The first term that's important to understand is the term technology giants. This is clearly more of a casual reference and a concept. It's not really a specific definition. So if there were to be actual legislation in the Congress, there would have to be something that's more specific. You couldn't just say this regulation applies to technology giants. So as we'll discuss in a bit, Senator Warren has proposed a similar regulation to what this topic does, but she says it would apply to companies that have more than $25 billion in annual revenue. Now, that said about kind of the lack of the specific definition, there generally are specific references to this term in the literature. If you read articles, you will find references to the big 5 as kind of being Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and sometimes Netflix. So, for example, this author in an article that he writes refers to them as the frightful 5, or the FANGs: Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. All right, so he says that the press now refers to them as big tech. So the press, like the popular press. So I think the term works in the resolution for the purposes of public forum debate, where you're not supposed to read a plan, and most teams don't read plans. It's very rare to encounter a plan in public forum. So I think the concept of reference to technology giants will work for the purposes of your debates, but that's what the term means. They are really giant because there is evidence, for example, that says that they consume or produce, I should say, 5 to 10% of all corporate profits. Of course, all corporations across the United States, they produce about 5 to 10% of the profits, and these profits are expected to double in size. And we'll talk about this in a little more detail when we talk about monopolies and when we get into the pro arguments. Antitrust. Antitrust is the idea that you do not want businesses to control or monopolize certain sectors of the economy. And basically, there's two ways to think of kind of a monopoly, or at least monopolies you want to avoid. First of all, maybe you want to avoid all businesses doing business in one area. So we don't want to have one airline or one cable company or one car brand. I mean, just think about it. If there was only one airline and you needed to fly somewhere, the airline could basically charge people as much as they could possibly afford for that ticket because they didn't have any other way to get to their destination. Similar if there's only one car company or one cable company. So the prices could get really high. So one particular concern in this area is, Instagram, which many debaters use. Facebook bought Instagram. And they also bought WhatsApp. So some people say that those were social media platforms that were developing as alternatives to Facebook, and Facebook just went in and bought them. The second is you don't want kind of businesses to control businesses across businesses. So you don't want telecommunications companies maybe to own apartment buildings. And this is all allowed actually in South Korea. So if you go to South Korea, you'll see a building called like SK Telecom Apartments. So once one company starts owning multiple different types of businesses, then that can get even worse, right? Because they have a branding advantage. They can bundle services. Oh, well, if you buy our apartments, you'll get like a cheaper phone bill. And we're starting to see that happen a little bit, especially with Amazon, right? Amazon originally started as an online bookstore, and now Amazon is, bought Whole Foods, a grocery store, right? So they're distributing groceries online and in the store. So we're starting to see some of that. In U.S. history, there have been large concerns about antitrust violations. And originally, in the early 1900s, there was a big movement against monopolization and antitrust. So an example of the John Rockefeller's Standard Oil is, as it says, is the classic example of an antitrust violation. It says the traditional account of the company's abusive actions is as follows. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Standard Oil expanded by purchasing competitors and using its clout to pressure service providers and railroads to provide the company discounts unavailable to small competitors. Where the company faced competition, it used its size to price competitors out of the market. In markets without compensation, the company raised final prices to end consumers. So this is exactly what some people fear Amazon is doing, that Amazon bought Whole Foods, and then because Amazon has so much capital or money, what they were able to do is sell groceries actually at a loss and really drive down the price of groceries. So it drove other businesses who don't have the capital that Whole Foods has. It took and it drove those businesses essentially could drive those businesses out of business once Amazon gets that monopoly, drives out these local grocery stores. Then it can just raise prices substantially again and make a lot of money. And then it kind of goes on to explain that by 1904, the company controlled 91% of U.S. oil production and 85% of oil sales. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court affirmed a lower court decision that found Standard Oil Group to be an unreasonable monopoly under the Sherman Act. We'll talk about these acts later. The Sherman Act was one of the acts that was designed to prevent monopolization, and the court ordered the company to break up into 34 independent firms with different management and directors. So they did kind of, you see, at the early 1900s, they broke up Standard Oil. The courts did. Now, since then, in recent times, as we'll discuss, there really hasn't been a lot of support to break up monopolies. It's very rare that the courts will intervene or that Congress will take any action against a monopoly. We've only seen a couple instances. So you kind of have in the U.S. economy a general trend toward monopolization generally, and specifically as we're seeing with the big tech. Now, why is antitrust relevant to big tech? Okay, well, we've already kind of seen like a couple instances of this where I discussed, right, where you have Amazon or where you have Facebook buying out competitors within its own industry. So they're purchasing like WhatsApp and Instagram. You have companies like Amazon is what they're doing. They're buying even unrelated industries and selling them. I even saw an article the other day that Amazon's starting to buy shopping malls, right? So there's a concern that Amazon and online retail generally was kind of driving, businesses. They can't support the stores anymore, getting driven out of the shopping malls. Shopping malls are collapsing. So Amazon goes in and they buy up the mall. Now, I don't know what they're going to do with the mall. Maybe they're going to sell it at a low price. Maybe they're going to do something else with it. Maybe they'll put their own stores back into the mall itself, right? The same way they're doing with Whole Foods and control both ends of the market. We'll see. But that, those are like two ways that it's relevant. A third problem, and this is really kind of unique to big tech. And when I say unique to big tech, it's different than the problem we had with Standard Oil, right? Where Standard Oil was just, where Standard Oil was buying up other companies, unrelated businesses, like we just discussed, Amazon buying Whole Foods. But these companies are platforms, right? So Amazon is a platform that originally just sold books. Now it sells a lot of other things, right? So, in addition to books, it's selling, appliances and foods, okay? But now it's also producing its own products, right? As we see the picture on the right, there's something called Amazon Basics, right? Where you can buy Amazon batteries. So it has its own products on the platforms themselves, right? And given Amazon's capital, they can undercut prices, but they also know what other consumers are willing to pay for goods because they have years of data of people purchasing batteries online. So they generally know what people are willing to pay for batteries, and they know what their competitors' batteries are selling for, right? So they know what Energizer and Duracell batteries are selling for under this platform, and what they can do is they can just they can just say, well, we're going to use Amazon Basics and undercut the price. And as I mentioned, it's easy for them to control the space. They have a lot of financial resources. So there was a website called diapers.com where this company was starting to sell diapers and get deals on diapers and sell diapers. And Amazon said, hey, went to them, offered to buy them out. At first they said no. So then Amazon just really lowered the price of diapers on its website. And then people started buying all their diapers at Amazon. Diapers.com started to struggle, so then they did take the Amazon buyout, and now there's good evidence that says Amazon has raised the price of diapers again. So you can see that there are definitely some potential problems here developing. Now, one additional thing that we often don't think of in terms of antitrust is privacy, right? People don't like their privacy being violated. Amazon, Facebook, all these companies, they make a lot of money. Facebook directly on data, selling data, using data for advertising. That's how Facebook doesn't charge anything, right? So it's basically how they make all their money, by monetizing the private information that you are providing for them. Now, people don't like privacy violations, but what does that have to do with antitrust? Well, it has to do with antitrust because if you're Amazon and you get everyone's data, right, then you know what people are willing to purchase goods for, and which goods are competitive, and what industries will succeed and which don't, and then you can buy companies like Whole Foods, right, and you know all of your consumer preferences. So maybe using that data does kind of start to create antitrust advantages. Maybe it protects monopolies. Maybe Amazon, like I say, can use the data against its competitors. And then there are questions like, well, they've built such big platforms. Is it fair for people like they don't even necessarily want to lease their platform? And then we have questions, is the platform different than the product? So again, Amazon has this big website. Is it just a website? Is it a platform where all kind of products are sold and they put different products on it? Or is it all kind of one big ecosystem? So when we look at the question, why is antitrust relevant to big tech? I mean, I think you already have a sense of that, right? That we need maybe to break up these kind of large monopolies that are emerging across these big five. And it's been advocated strongly by two people. One is Lisa Kahn, who was at the time a Yale law student. She wrote a first major piece on this in 2017 called The Antitrust Paradox, where she makes an argument that, hey, we used to enforce antitrust. We don't anymore. We need to break up these big five companies because they're leading to they're creating a concentration of economic power, which creates disproportionate influence. They're violating people's privacy, and over the long term, maybe they won't lower prices. And she's become a big name in kind of this movement to break up the monopoly. She's at Columbia Law School now, where she's kind of leads a group that deals with monopolization in big tech. Then there's a law professor, Tim Wu, who's also at Columbia, wrote a book called The Big Curse: Antitrust in the Gilded Age. Now, these readings are a little more complicated. Obviously, you have a book and you have a law review article, but I strongly encourage you, if you're debating this topic, to do your best to read those sources, because they provide a lot of rich kind of context and background to the dispute. And these are two of the leading people who are arguing for the breakup of big tech, especially people with really big qualifications. Now, where does it get tough? Well, the goal, in other words, what are the challenges? It's kind of previewing the con arguments a little bit. It gets tough because the goal of preventing monopolies has always been to kind of prevent price increases, right? To prevent people from kind of charging more, the product's getting really expensive, right? So the idea was Standard Oil, if it owned all the oil, it could charge whatever it wanted for it. It started to own all the railroads too, right? So then it also started to own the distribution channels for energy. So that really could create a lot of price increases. But most technology products are free, right? Facebook is free. Instagram is free. Google, its services are free or incredibly low cost. Even if you're a business, I use some of their business services. It's very, very cheap to get like email accounts and other things on Google, right? And Amazon, they don't really charge much. Their stuff's cheap. That's why people buy it. That's why people purchase it online. Now, maybe the even long-term prices, they say increases may never happen because there's such an economy of scale, right? You have Amazon selling so many products, it doesn't even need to make a lot of money on each one to make money. The third problem is that the focus has always been on the consumer, the purchases, right? But how are relatively kind of inexpensive phones and free online products bad? So, again, it's not really clear like how we should apply antitrust or why we should apply it to break up the big five if they're actually doing good things for consumers, which I think will get you into a framework debate that I'll bring up when I get into the pro and con arguments. But if you think really just the pro, right, the pro saying it's bad to build these big companies, have a lot of concentration of economic power that can influence political power, violate people's privacy. The con saying, hey, these things are really in the best interest of consumers. We should let technology to advance. These companies have money to make investments. So that's kind of at a broad stroke, kind of like where we are. Now, a big advocate of this is breaking this up, or is applying these laws, antitrust laws, or enforcing antitrust laws, is Elizabeth Warren, who's obviously a Democratic candidate for president. And she wants to do two things. First of all, she wants changes. She wants to create new laws that say you can't make a platform and sell things on it. If your revenue is greater than $25 billion. If your revenue is less than $25 billion, you can kind of do what you want. And she's not interested in regulating those industries. She's only interested in regulating big tech. Right? So she said, okay, Amazon, you're more than $25 billion in revenue, so you can't also have like Amazon basics, things like batteries, like your own batteries, your own branded batteries on your websites. But the second thing she wants to do is enforce existing antitrust law to say that you can't do business in other areas. You can't buy Whole Foods, right? So, this resolution, it says enforce antitrust law. So one of the big open questions is, can the pro advocate for additional laws, right? They can clearly advocate for enforcing existing laws, and we're going to talk about 3 of those in a second. Okay, but can they advocate for like this new additional Elizabeth Warren law that relates to platforms? And it's probably kind of hard if they can't, because that's, we're talking about enforcing antitrust law on big tech, and one of the things that makes big tech unique is that is that it has this platform and like sells its own products. But let's just kind of look briefly at kind of the current laws, okay? The Clayton Antitrust Act, there's a few things. It bars one company from acquiring another company, not forever, right? But when the effect of such an acquisition may be to substantially lessen the competition or to create a monopoly. Now, it doesn't offer much definition of what lessen competition or how much it has to be lessened or what exactly a monopoly is. And you say, well, I know a monopoly is when one company controls everything. Okay, we don't want that. But what about when Facebook bought Instagram? Instagram was worth, they bought it for $1 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money for Facebook. And then they bought WhatsApp for $17 billion. So even then, they probably just, people say they control maybe 60, 70% of the social media space. It's not 100%. Right? So do we allow them to kind of keep acquiring these other companies within their areas until they can't, until there are none left? Can Amazon, even if it owns like 50% of the e-commerce space, that's only 10% of like all commerce space. So can we let Amazon acquire the rest of the e-commerce space or 90% of it? Or do we not worry about them until they get like 100% of e-commerce space or 100% of commerce space? It's not clear. There's a Sherman Act that every contract combination or conspiracy to restrain and trade is bad. Monopolization or attempted monopolization is also prohibited. So make a look at the Sherman Act and say, well, they're attempting to monopolize. They're like moving down the road. The Federal Trade Commission Act bans unfair competition, unfair deceptive practices. Right? So these existing laws could potentially be enforced, which I think is where the resolution came from, right? Against big tech companies, because maybe they're attempting to do this, maybe they're that's intent, maybe it's lessening competition. There's certainly a debate. And some people say too, again, when we talk about making changes and whether or not the pro can advocate for those, some people say, look, it's kind of totally illegitimate to also like argue for making those changes, legitimate religion, because we need to apply these laws in some specific way to big tech. So again, I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself earlier, but kind of the basic framework questions. Look, the con is going to defend the status quo. And in the status quo, as I said, there's not really a push to enforce antitrust law. That antitrust law the need for antitrust law in the first place is determined by consumer price, and that the price of the modern service is good and low for consumers. Second of all, that the pro needs to make a change. You need to look beyond price. We need to look to the structural protection of power, influence on the political process, because when companies acquire so much power, so much economic power, they can make huge contributions directly or more importantly indirectly to politicians, and that can start to influence the political structure. Second, as I mentioned, it could create a long-term threat to consumers, where the consumers, it's really just about like price, and they're going to increase prices in the long term. Maybe there's privacy harms. The other thing I'll add is, there's an article in the New York Times on May 8th by one of the original founders of Facebook, who went to Harvard with Mark Zuckerberg, and he thinks Facebook should be broken up. He says basically with 2 billion people, I think, that he is using Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg basically, because he owns a majority of the company, he can really control global discourse because he controls like how that news feed works, what people see, what is acceptable and not acceptable to say on that platform, what ads like are run, like how consumers are influenced. And basically, he has a massive effect on like nearly, and not obviously all, but like that's a substantial portion of global discourse, and it can kind of lead to, regardless of what you think of his politics, right, or you think of anyone's politics, they have that much influence over the conversation, they're going to have that much influence over the outcome. Imagine if you got to teach or indirectly teach 2 billion debaters, like, how you might be able to shape them. So in the next lecture, we're going to move on to the pro arguments, but hopefully this gives you a good overview and a good start on the resolution.